I'm not quite sure actually how I'm going to follow both Larry and Nigel. It feels a bit sort of lacklustre, but I'll give it a good shot anyway. But as John says, the key is for these projects, they've been fantastic projects, but the idea is they don't sit on a shelf, they don't stop there, and they build something for the industry going forward. So it really is about what next, and what are we going to do with what we've learned. And so this is what I'm going to sort of cover today. Is first of all, actually, why was this project important in the start? And actually, it's really important to almost look back to look forward in terms of why it's important to us as an industry, and therefore why we need to focus on it going forward. Then I'm going to talk about something that I go on about quite a lot, and about how we reset this dialogue. And actually, it goes on really, I think, follows quite nicely in what Nigel's covered today, and actually how we really start to change the narrative around nutrition and around ruminant agriculture. And then actually, in terms of HEC, how do we start perhaps evolving our brand? And how we then start to evolve a brand, it's got to be underpinned by evidence in that brand. So these are the things I'm going to cover today. Right, I'm just going to play this quick video.
We are very lucky to have incredible lamb. I mean, for me, the Welsh lamb is the best lamb in the world. You know, it's far superior in flavour, fat, everything. The way the land it grows on, everything is incredible.
I think the thing that I would rate the highest was the taste.
I love the tenderness of the meat. I love the way it melts in your mouth. It's incredibly succulent, and it's just a fabulous eating experience.
Mae cigoen yn hyblyg tu hwnt, ti'n bod, fedri di rosio fo'n eitha clasurol yn blaen neu efo saws mint neu rhywbeth o la.
I didn't know there was so much nutrition in lamb.
I thought it was quite interesting, a lot less fat in lamb than I thought. Yeah.
Mae cigoen Cymru yn cynnwys pob elfen yn hwylo pan mae'n siopa cig coch, felly mae yna blas da iddo fe, mae yna olrain, ond hefyd mae'n cig am y bwrpas, felly gallai creu sawl gwahanol pryd wrth dewis coginio gyda wahanol rhannau o'r anifail.
Fi'n credu mi eisiau mwy o bobl sylweddoli pa mor iachus a blasus yw cigoen, a mi eisiau ni gyd prynu mwy o fe.
As a sheep farmer, it gives me great pride in producing a world-class product in Welsh lamb.
PGI Welsh lamb is so special. The biggest thing for me is the provenance. You know, I know where the sheep come from. I've seen where the sheep graze. I know the farmers, and it comes straight to me.
It gives me assurance, like if I go to a butcher, that where my meats come from is actually a good place and it's going to be healthy.
Ond mae'n hollol bwysig fod da ni ffermwyr rhywbeth sydd yn dangos i'r bobl, beth sy'n blasu gorau, wedi cael ei magu, siwr mae wedi cael ei magu, a fod rhywbeth o tystiolaeth tu ôl hwnna yn dangos yn glir i'r cyhoedd a i'r farchnadau. Dyma beth sydd wedi magu, dyma beth mae'n blasu, a dyma'r tystiolaeth sy'n dangos hynny. Fi'n credu hwnna'n rili bwysig.
Y bywyd mae'r cig yn cael yn Cymru, maen nhw'n bita gwair Cymraeg, anadlu haer Cymraeg, brefin Cymraeg, lam gorau yn y byd, mae pobl yn cychwyn sylwiad, unwaith mae'n cael blas yno fo. Maen nhw'n gwybod, cig oen gorau yn y byd, a fi, cig sa'n bywyd hapus, cig blasus.
The main thing is to be as local as possible, sustainable, traceable and visible.
So mae bwyta cig o Gymru, o ffermwyr lleol a ffermwyr bach yn rhywbeth dylen ni bod yn neud.
Finding out that lamb, and in particular Welsh lamb, is such a sustainable meat was really encouraging to hear.
So I believe this project will benefit the industry, as it will give all of us a better understanding of which traits affect the eating experience of PGI Welsh lamb, and hopefully we can take some learnings from which traits affect the eating experience and progress further with the quality of Welsh PGI lamb.
I think that actually sums up why this project's been so important, and actually I think it's a great video because it combines the perceptions of consumers, of industry stakeholders, of farmers, of chefs, of processors, and actually it shows it's a total industry impact, but actually most importantly it's about our consumers and about their perceptions. So it's really important how it brings all those things together in terms of meat eating quality, but also the environmental impacts as well. So that's why it's important, and that's why it's important that after the project now is finished, actually, that we need to still hold on to it and build upon those sort of foundation blocks established. Right, so this event, I'm very aware that it's called a finale event, but I actually think that's wrong, because actually it's almost the beginning. I think we really need, again, and I mean, we've had 3 fundamentally fantastic projects through the RMDP, and not one of them will be sitting on a shelf. So actually what it's about now from a HCC perspective is about legacy and actually how we can utilise what we've learnt through all of these projects. And actually quite nicely, a lot of them sort of overlap. So some of the concepts, some things we found out will overlap going forward. And it's just really key that we build upon these things. And in terms of today's focus and the meat eating quality, for us, it's really about how we can utilise what we've learned. So actually what Larry's presented today and also what Nigel's presented today, and how we move forward within our brands and how we evolve those brands. So first of all, it is about resetting the dialogue. And probably Nigel sort of touched upon this a little bit. And what we've done at the moment, and it goes back to your sort of slides where we look at sort of emissions for products. And at the moment we look very, quite a siloed view of it. And actually what we need to do is have a much more holistic approach of food choices. So I bore people silly with the same example. I probably should change the example sometimes. But actually, if you look at carbon footprint, if you take a 70-gram packet of crisps versus 70 grams of lamb, for example, actually the carbon footprint will be lower on the crisps, but actually nutritionally it's delivering nothing. So therefore, if we just always focus in terms of carbon emissions of food, rather than actually what we're getting in terms of nutrition, as Nigel's already articulated, that's where we start to have problems nutritionally. So actually what we need to do is really start to reset that dialogue, change the narrative around food choices. So we're not just looking at one metric, we're not just looking at carbon emissions and that impact, but actually we're looking at the total impact and actually what we get in terms of nutrition for those carbon emissions as well. What we also do, and this is part of our sort of strategy going forward, is we talk about something called total environmental footprint. And you know, there is a massive risk that when we start to just focus on carbon emissions, that actually we lose out on lots of other things. So from a HCC perspective, going forward, we're talking about resetting the dialogue around, obviously carbon has to feature there, and for the very reason Nigel touched upon Scope 3 emissions, it's really important not only to our supply chain, but also to us as human beings in terms of reaching our net zero targets as a country by 2050. But on top of that, we're also looking about biodiversity. We're looking at soil health, water quality and air quality, and actually how those fundamental metrics and the way that we farm in Wales and the way that we farm red meat underpins our product. It plays an important part in terms of its nutritional composition, as Larry's mentioned, in terms of those grasslands, but actually how we start to have a much more holistic and a much more grown-up conversation and dialogue when we're talking about food choices. Now, I've just captured a picture here. This is from The Guardian, but some of you will already be aware that actually eco-labelling is fastly hurtling towards us at the moment. And it's really key, therefore, that we are absolutely on the front foot here, that we're leading that dialogue, that we're not just looking at something in a one dimension, that we're looking at all dimensions in terms of delivery. And that's why it's really key that we sort of, as an industry organisation, that we actually really sort of demonstrate leadership in this area. It is complex, but actually it is our role, from a whole supply chain viewpoint, that we demonstrate leadership and that we encourage those conversations, that viewpoint, in terms of looking at food systems much more holistically rather than just down single metrics. HCC are already in this space. It's not new. We've been talking about nutrition for years, we've been talking about sustainability for years, but the idea is that the evidence that we've received through the project is it can sort of further underpin what we're talking about, but also it can start to have a much more joined up nature in terms of how we underpin our brands. So we've already got some great resources, we've been talking about this for a long time, but actually now we've got a little bit more evidence, and that's the key thing here, is that we can evolve our brands in a much more evidence-focused way, also following the science and also following new developments that come along the way. So evolving the brand, and this is where I probably need to be really quite sort of transparent, and it's very much about short, sort of medium and long-term sort of evolving of the brand. This is not going to happen overnight, but what we're really keen to do is, obviously at the moment, the Welsh PGI brands, and I have added beef in. I appreciate this is a lamb event, but I've also added beef in here, but for both PGI Welsh beef and lamb, it's about that long-term evolving of that geographical sort of provenance-based branding. That's not to say it's not important, but long term it's about a commitment that we start to build in other sort of brand values that can be underpinned by evidence, hence why we're looking at a mid to long term prospect here, but how we start to build those environmental metrics through data to start to build upon our brands. So actually what we do is we add some real significant brand values that supplement and absolutely support that provenance-based focus as well. Now, the key for that is actually how we evidence it. Just because we feel it, just because we know it, just because we farm it, isn't enough. We have to evidence actually why our brand is very different and why these environmental impacts are key. So these are some things actually, again, this is going sort of across sort of the short, medium and long term, because this is a long journey. It's a very transparent, it's a long journey. But actually what we have done is we're in the process of commissioning a life cycle analysis for Welsh lamb and Welsh beef. Though actually will be quite pioneering. It'll use a much bigger data set than we've used to date. We've had a really good start in terms of the Welsh Way data, which you saw before with the 20 farms, but actually we know that we need to build upon that. And we know that actually what we need to do is we need to have a consistent measurement going forward where we can really start to evidence some of the things. But also the LCA will work in both ways. So obviously it's a very useful measure in terms of supply chain information and data, but also it will tell us what advice we can also give to our farmers. It's not about resting on laurels, it's about driving efficiency, it's about driving and seeing actually where those sweet spots are in terms of decarbonising our farms. So it's a really important piece of work for us that we'll be hopefully releasing later in the year, but actually going forward it will form a really important part of our sort of brands going forward. Now, linking into that, we've also committed to developing a red meat roadmap. So it's a roadmap to net zero, but there's a fundamental difference actually with our roadmap because we will also be overlaying a sort of a roadmap to nature recovery at the same time. So we're not just sticking at carbon. Again, it's about practicing what we preach in terms of a holistic approach. And it's really key for us that we identify those key milestones along the route to net zero that not only mean that we're decarbonising our sector, but also actually we can capture what the sector's doing for nature at the same time. And it goes back to underpinning that holistic approach and highlighting the important role that farming and ruminant agriculture has in terms of managing biodiversity and nature restoration in Wales at the same time. So again, the roadmap, I'm very frank, the roadmap will have to be completely transparent. It may well become a movable feast, as science develops, as concepts change. So we will be developing this later this year, and it fits quite nicely with the LCA work. But it will be about transparency, honesty within. There may well be some U-turns on the way in the roadmap, but actually it's about how we can evidence it and how we can make our sort of promises with the sector going forward. Now, part of this, and hopefully you can see how this all joins together, is also about sort of baselining. And I'm a bit of a baseline bore, to be honest, because I think they're really important. We don't have enough of them. We say things again, but we don't really know unless we've got a baseline, we remeasure. We don't know whether we're doing the right or the wrong thing. Now, at HEC, and actually part of one of the other projects, has already created our first baseline. So we've, through the Hill Ram Scheme, we've done some great biodiversity audits on some of the Hill Ram Scheme farms, which has created actually a pretty sort of a first really in terms of Wales's hill farms, a baseline sort of biodiversity, a baseline for biodiversity on those farms. And what we want to do is build upon that. So again, it goes back to evidencing these things we want to say about our brands going forward. It's not enough that we know them, that we farm them, that we feel them, that we see them, but actually we need a much more data-driven way of underpinning how we really focus on evidencing the environmental aspects of our brand and how we produce red meat in Wales. Now, just perhaps going forward now in terms of the short term, some people are always very interested, what are we doing now? And I probably would be just as guilty as that as a farmer, as looking sort of longer term. But in terms of this year, so our sort of comms and marketing team at the moment are planning their sort of lamb campaign for later this year. And already front and centre will be taste, will be sustainability, and will be our farmers. And the idea is that some of the evidence that we've got from the project absolutely underpins that campaign. and it's really sort of showcasing our farmers as heroes, as real sort of heroes of the environment, the way they're producing sustainable food that's tasty, but also delivering for the environment. So there is some short-term activity that is absolutely picking up those sort of consumer demand drivers, but also the evidence that we've had through the Eating Quality project at the same time. Now, this is probably just a nice thing, almost to leave you on, and I won't read it out, because there's nothing worse than someone reading out the slide, but I think this is really pertinent, and I think this where it shifts that dialogue, and it's really key, and probably every one of us in this room has got a role to play, as well as HGC in terms of our leadership role, in terms of how we make more sustainable choices, but it doesn't have to mean that we're compromising on nutrition, because if we're not focusing on what we need as humans, then actually it's not very sustainable. Diolch yn fawr.